Hello and welcome wherever you are around the world to our live stream, to our chat about Formula One, the sport that I love. I think you do too, hope you do. And all that goes with it, whether it be the past, the present, the future, the drivers, the engineering, the sponsorship, the politics, the drama. It's all there. It's all in this show, all in this live stream. Just push me hard enough and we'll find enough tributaries to go down and talk about it. A bit of a interesting show I think I've got lined up today, hopefully. A viewer's suggestion last week was that I picked a race, any race from the past, he said, he or she, and sort of do an analysis a bit along the lines of the analyses I do during the season with an event that's just happened or is happening. And I thought that was quite an interesting idea. So I've done a few similar things in the past. I've voiced over some mute, wonderful footage from AP Archive from various Grand Prix and put my comments to the pictures, as it were, which has been a lot of fun. So I'm going to have a go today and do that. And I won't spoil it now. I'll tell you what race it's going to be, but I'll have a go. It probably it'll be live, so it'll be a bit dodgy probably. But we'll I'll see how it feels and how it goes. I think I've got the race sorted out that I want to try and talk about anyway. It's quite a complicated one. Anyway, that. And before we start, just sort of, I always have a bit of a chat about matters of moment, as it were. The latest sort of story, trending news thing, obviously in a period now where it's very quiet for Formula One news. Somebody's dug up some sort of story about the FIA have actually responded to it. I suppose that's the significant thing, about possible conflict of interest between Toto Wolff and his wife Susie. Susie working, of course, I say of course, in case you didn't know, she used to run a Formula E team, and now she works for Liberty running the F1 Academy, which is the female racing thing. So that's good. And she's doing a good job there, obviously, as she would. And so she basically works for Liberty, who are the commercial rights holders of Formula One. And there's Toto Wolff, who is a team principal of the Mercedes Formula One team. And there is, of course, I say of course, again, I'm not sure it is something that you would necessarily assume. There is quite a big stroke barrier between the team principals, the teams, if you like, the teams, and the commercial rights holder, and also the FIA for that matter, who are sort of in the middle, straddling the two as the sort of administrators of the sport. And the suggestion is that there is a conflict of interest because there would be chat, obviously, one would guess, between Susie and Toto. Susie chatting about her side of the fence, i.e. Liberty, and maybe some confidential stuff. And Toto, his side, maybe some confidential stuff. And some people, not sure who, some people have drawn this to have just said, isn't there a conflict of interest? I smell Bernie Ecclestone behind all this, to be honest, because the magazine in which it appeared is a magazine that he's always been quite friendly with and quite often has sort of put stories towards, I guess, or ideas. I'm not saying that for sure, but it's just got that feel to it. Bernie would, sort of mischievous thing that Bernie would like to do, I think. But the reality is that the FIA have now said we're aware of this accusation of the conflict of interest and our committee will now be looking into it. What's the actual wording they have? Let's have a look and see how they actually phrase that. This is a statement from the FIA. The FIA is aware of media speculation centered on the allegation of information of a confidential nature being passed to an F1 team principal from a member of FOM personnel, which basically means Liberty, I guess. The FIA compliance department is looking into the matter. It's like, boom, boom, wow. Well, I've got two responses to that, in case you're interested. One is, it's all a mess and has been ever since Bernie created the commercial rights of Formula One that he sold to Leo Kirsch in whatever it was, 1999, and then currently now owned by Liberty. Before that, of course, the commercial rights didn't really exist as an entity because they were sort of part of the sport, and Bernie was running all the teams, and the teams kind of owned everything. And then without the teams knowing, Bernie had sort of created all these little subdivisions called TV rights, sponsorship rights, travel rights. And those are the things he sold off to Leo Kirsch. And the teams were basically left with an income based on the Concord Agreement that they could sign with the new commercial rights holders. And that's where we are today. I've always contended, for people who've watched my channel for a long period of time now, that the commercial rights are, how can I phrase this without getting into trouble? It's better for the sport to be owned and run by its stakeholders rather than third-party companies that come in with a massive amount of money and buy the commercial rights. I've always maintained that. And if Bernie hadn't sold them, we'd still be in a position where we didn't actually have this sort of third-party wagging, or the tail wagging the dog, as it were. The problem, of course, and the reason that's never happened, is because most of the Formula One team owners at the time when Bernie was putting the whole empire together were sufficiently inept not to understand what Bernie was doing and not to prevent him taking all the commercial rights out of the sport, which is why Liberty now own them. If all the commercial rights were owned collectively by the teams as part of their franchise, I think the sport would be very different. Possibly not as good in some ways, because maybe the assets wouldn't have been there to underwrite all the races that were underwritten, say, during the COVID crisis, or indeed getting American races onto the calendar. Although I'm not sure that television rights income would necessarily be any less if we didn't have a commercial rights holder, a third-party commercial rights holder. So that's up for debate, I think. So that's one thing. I'm not a fan of commercial rights as an entity, and I don't think necessarily they're always in the best interests of the sport. I'm not talking necessarily about Formula One now, I'm talking about sport in general. And when you look at the way golf's going, for example, with LIV and the amount of money that's coming in there and the disruption that's caused, yes, a few golfers have made a fortune out of it, but is it a better sport now that it's split down the middle and half the players are on one side, half are on the other? And I'm sure it's the same with some other sports as well. Golf's the one I know a bit about. So that's one point. The other is, if the FIA are going to decide that this is a matter that has been brought to their attention and they're going to refer it to their compliance committee, quote unquote, why make that public? Why tell people about that? Why beat your chest and say, we have a compliance department and we're going to investigate? Surely if you're going to do an investigation, it's much better to do it on the QT and then talk about it, isn't it? Why alert everybody that you're going to do it? Doesn't make any sense to me at all. So I was a bit, I think it's good that they're investigating this so-called accusation. I have to say here, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. But why tell people about it? Just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, that's me. That's my rant for the opening. And I've got some other stuff apart from going to give a try to this business of analysing a race from the past. I've got some other stuff as well, which I'm going to bring into the show at some point. Not quite sure when. And those who are very keen Darren Heath fans, and I've probably quite a lot of you there, photographer extraordinaire, really, really good guy, great photographer, good friend of mine, lives in New Zealand now, been in Formula One for a long time, and one of the great photographers, no doubt, has agreed to do an interview, which I'm going to do with him next Monday. So if you want me to ask Darren a question, ask them today in the live stream, and I'll try and get to them, try and get through all of them, have a look anyway. And if not, I don't know what, because I'm going to record it because of the time difference and because of everything else. And, it's always a bit of a drama because you never know what the internet is going to be like for the other person, which is why I'm not massively into doing live interviews, if you see what I mean. So anyway, Darren Heath, that'll be on next week's show, which will be out probably next Wednesday, this time next week. So that'll be good, I think. Looking forward to it. So it'd be nice to get a couple of your questions in there as well. But to kick this one off now, before I get on to anything else, let's have a look at some of your questions already. There's quite a lot there. Thank you those who are joining. And don't forget, if you just ask whatever question you like. Doesn't matter if you think somebody's already asked that question, because, so what? Nobody's going to watch this show all the way through from beginning to end, I wouldn't have thought. So I'm just going to This is from Aaron Lee, who's one of our regulars. Hi, Aaron. Thanks very much for joining us and for this question. Doing my usual thing of trimming the picture, so the wording, so it becomes legible. Now it's a bit too big. Let's just get that square. That was because of the other message I put up there, which had to go a bit bigger. So there we go. Aaron Lee. Hi, Peter. Which drivers were the most and least interested in how other drivers drove? E.g. watching them from the car or trackside, thinking about their pedal and steering inputs, etc. Well, instantly springing to my mind is Carlos Reutemann, who was very interested in how other drivers drove, particularly drivers he respected, obviously, in his era, back end of Jackie Stewart's career, and then Emerson, and then Mario, Alan Jones, Nicky, and he was always asking questions of how they looked compared with him on the corner, which was usually my job during practice, and where they were changing gear and what their gear changing sounded like and so forth and so on. So he instantly springs to mind. A driver with zero interest who springs to mind is Christian Klein, who drove for Jaguar, didn't he? When all that abortive, ridiculous Jaguar F1 team thing. And Christian Klein was sort of young superstar, young driver. And I'll never forget, it was Michael's last race at Ferrari, and we were at Brazil. And I think it was the last race, not the second last. I'm pretty sure it was the last race at Interlagos. And you know, there we were. He wasn't having a brilliant season, but he was driving beautifully. You know, he's driving the absolute nails off this thing. And Interlagos is a good circuit for viewing. It's not difficult. You just walk out the back of the pits and you look down behind you, and you got that lovely right-hander, the double apex right-hander with the hard braking while you've still got load on the car. And Christian Klein wasn't driving. He was, I don't know what he was doing, but he was standing there on the bank, chatting to some people, and Michael was out there. And I remember thinking, you know, this is maybe the last time we're ever going to see Michael Schumacher driving. Everyone's going to be goggle-eyed at this. And he stood there for the entire session with his back to the track, chatting to these people. Never watched a single lap, as far as I can remember. He didn't, because I remember thinking afterwards, that is just so ridiculous. I mean, it's just like, it's like any young tennis player walking past a court on which Roger Federer is warming up with his coach and not stopping to watch for 3 or 4 minutes at least. Didn't watch anything. And you know, obviously Oscar Piastri is a driver who does pay attention and has learned and isn't afraid to talk about it. But in my experience, I would say 95% of the drivers that I've ever known aren't that interested in what other drivers are doing, because they don't think it's relevant to their job, and what they have is a unique bubble with this car, this engineer, these mechanics, this budget, and how he drives it is the only way it can be driven, and nobody could do a better job. That's how most drivers think. It's a bizarre thing. Most athletes in other sports are very self-critical. I guess because you get much more of an instant response of whether you've done something well or not, whereas in racing there are so many things you can blame if you're not going well. And so, you know, I've talked before on this live stream about the time I was talking to Heikki Kovalainen about his braking and how he's very different from Lewis on the telemetry that Rob Wilson was able to look at when he was asked to do so by McLaren. And I was trying to help him a bit, and he said, "I'm not interested. You know, I brake later than Lewis, but I've got nothing to learn from Lewis." Which I thought was a really strange thing, but it's, you know, thinking about it now, it's a pretty standard approach, really. I mean, Alan Jones used to say, speaking of Alan, used to say, you know, I learned to drive from my dad. He always told me the quickest way was to go in a straight line and not sideways. Well, yeah. It wasn't particularly clear in the way Alan drove, because quite often he had at least 3 or 4, 5, 6 degrees out of line on the back end of the Williams when he was on the limit. Well, the shadow too. I mean, he was definitely an oversteer driver. So yeah, thank you, Alan, for that one. But equally, you know, he did talk about that, which was good. But you know, for the most part, I'm struggling to think of drivers who can talk about and have talked about other drivers that they watch and learn from. And I guess that's why periodically we do have these amazing geniuses just coming out of the woodwork, like Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc of the current era, maybe Oscar, maybe some others, because there is this sort of pretty high standard of driving, but they're all kind of stagnating around their own performance, and then you get these geniuses coming along, and they do stand out because they are so much better than the average. It's a good question, very good question. Thank you very much, Aaron. I'm not sure, I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask about that. There are probably others as well that know the story too, but that's my experience anyway. And Aaron's got another question now. So I'll put that up because you always ask good questions. Why not? Here we go. Put this on here. Okay, nearly there. Sorry about this. Make that a bit smaller. And move it over. There we go. Finally get there. Took a bit longer than it should have. Aaron Lee, does luck play a large role in car design? The competitiveness of many, but not all, technical directors' cars have fluctuated quite a lot in recent years. Jody Eggington, Andy Green, James Allison. You know what? I think it does. I'm sure a lot of current TDs and their team members would say, well, that's a load of old rubbish because everything is so data driven. How can there be any room for luck? But, it's if you think about the Braun double diffuser thing, it was a Japanese aerodynamicist who sort of pushed this idea, and they went for it and it worked. And is that luck or what? It's difficult to tell, really, isn't it? It really depends how you define luck as well, because you could say, as I actually have a maxim on my website, peterwindsor.com, which I don't use very much. I'm going to try and revive it fairly soon. There is no such thing as luck. For everything, there is a cause and a reason. And obviously that is true. If you can always trace a root cause, or find a root cause of everything that happens in the world. But luck in this sense, obviously less so now because the rule book defines a lot of the design of the car, and there are so many standard parts on the car now as well. And a lot of it is to do with building blocks and the information you have that governs the turnings you can take when there is an alternative, when you can either go in direction A or direction B, regardless of how small the detail is on the car upon which you're working. If you have the right building blocks that go back over a decade of very good performance, you're going to do a better job of choosing the right option than if you are a startup, and you are new on the grid. And in that case, we don't really know. We'll go for option B. It worked. That's when luck comes into play, I guess. And I think you'll find, if you look at the performances there of Jody Eggington, Andy Green, James Allison. I mean, Andy Green is a good example of a guy who's always said, when he was on the edge of budget, but building good cars, if we had a bit more budget, I could do a lot more. And he's talking as much about the building blocks as he is about covering all bases of where he was at in terms of information. And it's proved to be correct. And much of the credit for the performance of the Aston Martin the first half of this year should go to Andy Green. And I think it's a new team on it now. So it's actually not as competitive now as it was at the start of the year, interestingly. And Andy's now in a different part of the empire there. James Allison, I don't think he's luck driven. I think he's got quite an empirical mind, isn't he? He definitely is creative. If you think about those forward-facing exhausts he had on the Lotus thing that Kimi raced, and the good work he did at Ferrari, and then obviously a lot of personal upset and tragedy and sadness in his life, and then he came to Mercedes, did a great job, and yeah, I think by and large he's pretty much on the money in terms of where he's going, and not luck-driven. Jody, just a good guy who works very hard, and I think being at AlphaTauri is not an easy job because you're always sort of second fiddle to Red Bull. You're using their technology, but you're kind of not in a way. I'm not saying Italy's a bad place to be doing a Grand Prix car. It's probably not a great place to be doing a Grand Prix car if you're in the same country as Ferrari, and it is Italy as well, because you're definitely going to be behind the 8 ball there in terms of suppliers and so forth. But I think Jody does a very good job. And what impresses me about Jody is how much of a Mario Andretti fan he is. I think that's just brilliant. You know, he's a real racer, and for an engineer to say, well, you know, the guy I would like to have dinner with more than anybody else in the world is Mario Andretti, then to my mind, Jody Egginton knows what he's doing, and no surprise that the AlphaTauri finished the year very well. And I'm glad they did, because there's a good bunch of guys there. Jonathan Eddles, another one, very good at AlphaTauri. So here's another one. Let's have a look as we get into the show. So this is from Malaysia. Good. I'm going to say one of my favorite countries. I've had some very nice vacations in Malaysia, notably in Penang, and also I love the circuit. As you well know, Sepang to me is one of the great Grand Prix circuits, and it's such a shame it's not on the calendar. And it's a good circuit, you know, it could be brought up to spec in half an hour probably. Cylinder 12, yeah, that's another great name. 12-cylinder, normally aspirated engine, V12, wonderful. Hi Peter, I'm an F1 fan from Malaysia. I'm extremely fortunate to have witnessed F1 greats from Senna to Verstappen today. My favourite will always be Michael. Can you do a comparison between him and Max? Yeah, I mean, I've said this before, but I'll repeat it. You know, I think I think the major difference is that Michael had this sort of global view of motorsport and this overall global presence that enabled him to do what he did at a relatively young age, to take good people from Benetton and basically with Jean Todt and Ross Brawn put that whole team together at Ferrari, completely rebuild Ferrari, and Michael should take a lot of the credit for that and win those additional 5 world championships. And I don't, you know, he'll never have the opportunity to do that because Max will always be at Red Bull. I'm sure he will. But even if he decided to leave Red Bull, I'm not sure Max would. I'm not sure he's got that sort of Michael feel for exactly the right person to do exactly the right job on the car around the team. I may be wrong because we've never seen that with Max. He's never had to do that. But you know, that's basically what Jackie Stewart did with Ken Tyrrell, built the team around Jackie, and they were all good people. And that's basically what Niki Lauda did with Luca Montezemolo at Ferrari in '74, rebuilt the team around his own idea of how Ferrari should be. And that's what Michael did. And not many people have done that. A lot of people have tried. I mean, Emerson tried, didn't work with his own F1 team. Alan Prost tried, didn't work. He couldn't do it. And Nicky tried a second time and couldn't do it. And it's not easy. I mean, Jack Brabham obviously is the other one who did it so well. Dan Gurney, very, very good for a very short period of time, but I think found it difficult to keep all the balls in the air financially to keep the Formula One program going. And the minute Goodyear said, no, we want you winning the Indy 500, Dan, that's where the bulk of our sponsorship's going. Dan just closed down the F1 program. So, you know, that with Michael, if you look at the way Michael worked Bridgestone with Ross Brawn and basically engineered a situation where Ferrari were exclusive on Bridgestone, which is why they won so many championships. You know, that's pretty impressive. It's pretty adept politically. And, you know, obviously John Todd has to take credit there as well. So I think that's the difference that I would say away from the track. On the track, I wouldn't have said there was a lot of difference between Michael and Max in terms of the technique of driving a good car and or a bad car and coming up with a compromise solution of how to drive a bad car as well as it could be driven physically for one lap around the circuit, or 50 laps for that matter. I don't think there was a lot of difference. Michael was very, very good in that area. In terms of track craft, massive difference. I think Michael had a certain arrogance about him that Max doesn't have. Max has got a razor sharp racer's edge that is just, he's just a racer. That's all he is. Whereas Michael has this arrogance of, this is my track, a bit like the Senna arrogance, you know, this is my bit of road, nobody else can be on it. Whereas Max thinks about how to get to that bit of road. And so Max, in that sense, I think is a more, to use the FIA word, a more compliant driver, in the sense that he doesn't force the issue. Whereas Michael, as we know, forced the issue, you know, the Monaco thing, the Jerez thing, and a couple of other bits as well. And odd things as well with Michael, you know, what was that business of when he crashed, or he went off, didn't he, on this formation lap in Shanghai one year? I mean, you don't see Max, or do you? No, you don't see Max doing that sort of thing. Sort of odd things that Michael used to do. And I suppose the other big difference is that Max lives the right life to be a racing driver in Formula One, whereas Michael was absolutely on the edge all the time, wasn't he? If he wasn't in the race car, he seemed to be racing bikes, or having fun on racing bikes, or skydiving, or, you know, doing something that was adrenaline driven. And that was, I'm not sure Max, maybe it's just the whole Red Bull thing just control him incredibly well. If he was left to his own devices, he'd be just the same, I don't know. But I think that's a difference as well. You could argue Max thinks that through a little bit better than Michael did. You know, Michael, for all his preparation, the techno gym, bringing a new standard of fitness to the racetrack that nobody had ever seen before really, which others very quickly had to sort of emulate, balanced against his propensity for skydiving and bikes. And Max, you don't sort of see that side of Max. He just sort of appears in the paddock and he wins races and disappears. And it's kind of nice, isn't it, how Max is like that. So, but anyway, I think you're really talking about the technique. And I'd say technique-wise, lap for lap, not a lot in it. Not a lot in it. And, you know, obviously different eras, different technology, different this, different that, but not much in it. Not much in it at all. William Grounds. Let's have a look here. What are we doing here? But the reason you see me just sort of studying this, I'm trying to work out which lines and where to cut them to take them down to the next line, so it all fits in and it's all legible. William Grounds. Hi Peter, I was wondering if you had observed how sport often travels to regions around the world in seasons. For example, Formula One, MotoGP and Grand Slam tennis go to the UK and France at similar times. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And I often say, you know, how is it that the FIA haven't sat down with the Wimbledon organisers and just decided that they wouldn't clash with the British Grand Prix and Wimbledon? And they don't seem to care. I mean, Bernie had that thing of just not caring about any of the other sport dates. The only one he cared about were the Olympics and the World Cup. Apart from that, he just put the races on when he wanted to put them on. And I think Formula One's kind of continued in that vein ever since, which is a great shame, because quite often you see, oh wow, the week before the Hungarian Grand Prix, it was that mega tennis tournament. Wouldn't it have been great if it was all happening at the same weekend and the drivers could have mixed with the tennis players or vice versa? Of course, it never really happens, even if they are in the town at the same time. Although that's not true, because I remember when Australian Grand Prix in Adelaide often used to be, I wouldn't say clash, it was a great thing. It was in harmony with the South Australian Open Golf. And quite often, the Formula One drivers were invited to the Pro-Am and played 18 holes with one of the top pros. And that was a great thing. I loved to see that sort of stuff going on. And usually there was some mega concert as well, not organised by the Formula One people. It was just sort of totally there, but happened to be on. Sting one year, I remember, sitting in the bar of our hotel at the Hilton, chatting away. Yeah. Derek Warwick, Nigel Mansell, Sting. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, obviously when you think about Europe, it's all to do with the summer and how short the summer is, and you cram everything together like the Great British Sporting Summer, which is in no particular order the Henley Regatta, the obviously the test match at Lord's and whatever other cricket comes after that. Wimbledon tennis, British Grand Prix, and is there anything else you'd include in the British sporting summer? I suppose there's some sort of big horse races there, Epsom Derby or something. One of my daydreams when I was a kid was to be the first guy ever to score 100 at Lord's and win the British Grand Prix. Not necessarily in the same year, but to do that. And maybe win Wimbledon too. Let's throw that in. It'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? I wonder if someone will do that one day. I mean, in the same way that if you wanted to look back into the 1930s and say to one of the drivers, if you could, can you imagine that in the year 2023, a driver was going to win the world championship by 200 points or something, 22 race series? They'd all just think you were completely mad. But it happened. And so I suppose 300 years from now, somebody might do that, score 100 at Lord's and win the British Grand Prix. The nearest we've come to that with a racing driver, possibly Alfonso de Botago, who raced in the Grand National as a jockey and did the Cresta run it was in the Olympic team for the Cresta run. Who else has done something brilliant like that? There must be somebody else who's been very, very good at another sport. James Hunt was junior Wimbledon, wasn't he? So that's not bad. Pretty good. Pretty good. Pretty good. Okay, so that's that one. Where are we going now? I've lost my train of thought. Not train of thought, I've lost my ability to understand where I'm going. Okay, but on the computer, that is. I could do one more, and then I'm going to have a go at doing this race. So if you want to go and have a coffee and disappear and not listen to it, you can. You're welcome to. On the other hand, it might be quite fun watching me stumble and fall. Okay, it's the last one I'm doing. Oh, I like this one. Tin plate railway. My son Jack would love that. He loves freight trains and anything to do with trains. Funnily enough, he's not massively into passenger trains or steam trains. He just loves freight trains. We were talking about potential holidays today, and he was saying, I just want to go to Canada and sit at Swift Current or Medicine Hat and watch freight trains all day. That would be my perfect holiday, Dad. And hit golf balls. Pretty easy to do. My tin plate railway. Dear Peter, is it a unique occurrence that not one team has changed its drivers from one season, 2023 to 2024? Any conclusions to be drawn? Probably is unique. I think it is unique. I'd need to ring my mate Sean Kelly about that. I don't have that stat absolutely to hand, but I suspect it probably is. Any conclusions to be drawn? Well, I suppose the first is that racing's much safer than it used to be, so drivers are around a lot longer. And so if the driver's still going well and he's in a good team, there's no incentive for him to stop. So there's that. What else? Oh, also, I think in the Liberty era, I think people seem to respect contracts more. Maybe that's another point. In the old days, contract was, what does it mean really? Just sort of something to talk about. If the money didn't arrive in the bank at the appropriate time, you'd ring your boss up and say, where's the money? And say, oh, well, a bit late. Yeah, well, got a contract, but didn't have much effect. Today, a little bit different. Everything is very, very visible, isn't it? Has to be, I guess. So I guess it's those two factors. Racing's very safe, A, and B, contracts are much more binding than they used to be. Then I'm thinking Oscar Piastri, the whole Alpine fiasco. How binding are they? I know there was no written contract, but there was a contract in the sense that there was a handshake, I guess, and he'd done a lot of testing for them on the basis that he was their chosen driver of the future. And when Alonso left, they announced him as their race driver. So that's, didn't need a contract. He was the race driver. But then he walked out and went to McLaren. And for that, just to clear up any misunderstanding there, I'm not saying that if you had a clean choice between a young driver driving for Alpine or driving for McLaren, that he should have stayed at Alpine. Absolutely not. I would go to McLaren. Obviously, it's the team. It's the better team for a guy in his position. It's the better team anyway. All I'm saying is, given the situation he was in, it was a very, very odd thing. And I still find it quite difficult to get my head around that one. So, but yeah, interesting. Poor Mick Schumacher. He's been droning around Manucourt for the last 2 days, tyre testing for Pirelli in the rain. Can't think of anything more depressing than being at Manucourt, empty Manucourt, on your own, one car, in the wet, tyre testing. But good on Mick, you know, at least he got the mileage in. He would have done a good job too, I think. Very good job. He's a good man, good driver, does it well, and good for Mercedes that they're there. And for those that are joining now, I have already talked about my thoughts on this argy-bargy about the supposed conflict of interest between Toto and his wife, Susie. Toto being a Formula One team principal, Susie working for Liberty, and isn't it terrible that there's a conflict of interest between the two? And I've said one, well, you know, to me, I'm not a fan of the commercial rights entity anyway. And I think I can make another point now, which is that why should there even be a conflict of interest? I mean, in reality, surely they should be working hand in glove, shouldn't they? The commercial rights holders and the teams that actually make the sport what it is. Shouldn't it? Why should there be any confidentiality between the two? It should be completely open, you would have thought. But then again, that's, you know, I suppose with the cost cap and everything, there has to be some sort of Chinese wall. But I mean, you know my thoughts on the cost cap. That was always never going to work properly, the way it was designed to work. And then the other point, just to reiterate what I was saying at the start of the show, if the FIA have got their compliance committee involved now to look at all this, why tell everybody? Why not keep it secret? Isn't that a more logical thing to be doing? Anyway, here we are now, and what I'm gonna do now is change this text now to the race that I'm going to talk about. Ta-da! How about that? 1962 German Grand Prix, Nürburgring. Don't go away, because it's an amazing weekend, and I'll sort of begin it now as I would kind of begin it if I was doing. It's obviously going to be one video. I'm not going to be doing qualifying in the race, so it's just one video. But it'll start like this. So the German Grand Prix was not only held at a circuit that is the mother and father of Grand Prix circuits, the Nürburgring, 14 miles of tortuous corners and hills and drops, and also some long straights, narrow straights as well. But also it was the home race of the major German Formula One team, by which I mean Porsche, he says with a smile, because Dan Gurney had done a brilliant job adapting the new flat 8 Porsche to his liking, setting it up the way he knew it could work, and won the French Grand Prix. Admittedly, a race that Ferrari, this is a little bit earlier in the season, a little bit that Ferrari had missed, because as ever, the Italian spring and summer was plagued by industrial action, which was affecting the Ferrari factory. It was a work to rule thing, which effectively meant there ain't going to be Grand Prix cars ready for every race. So Dan won at Rouen in the Porsche, first ever win for the Porsche Grand Prix team. And then came the German Grand Prix, when Porsche knew Ferrari would be definitely racing, with 4 cars entered. And they did what Mercedes probably would have done if they were in Grand Prix racing at the time. They basically hired the Nordschleife. And in the build-up to the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, they not only did endless testing there with Dan and Joe Bonnier, the other driver, but also did a full Grand Prix distance testing with Dan Gurney. And to my thinking, that is possibly the first example of a team doing a full Grand Prix distance before a race, purely to check reliability and performance. So Porsche came to the German Grand Prix very well prepared. We should also put this race in the context of the 62 season, which was the second of the new 1.5 litre formula. And it was unbelievably competitive. The first round of the championship was won by Cooper, the second round by BRM, the third by Lotus, the fourth by Porsche. So there's 4 different manufacturers winning the first 4 races. Then Lotus won again at Aintree with Jim Clark, the new Lotus 25 monocoque. And then came the German Grand Prix. So, and Ferrari had yet to win a race. And of course, they won the World Championship in 61. And they'd revamped the cars a little bit. Not much more power, a little bit heavier, actually. Phil Hill wasn't too happy. And the world champion from 61. And Lola had not won a race, even though John Surtees had looked very, very good in the Bowmaker Lola, run by Reg Parnell, powered by the Climax V8 engine. Should also mention that Coventry Climax were providing these V8 engines now that were right on the money in terms of being competitive with the Porsche and the Ferrari and the BRM. V8 format first appeared the previous year at the German Grand Prix in Jack Brabham's Cooper. And the Climax engine really enabled a lot of startup teams to begin their lives as well. Lola, good example. Jack Brabham, another very good example, won the World Championship with Cooper 59 and 60, 61 with Cooper as well. But 62, he decided that he would do his own Grand Prix team and design his own and build his own cars with Ron Toronac. And along the way, having left Cooper, he ran and bought from Colin Chapman a Lotus 24, which he raced and did very well with. He actually won a race, a non-championship race after the German Grand Prix in the Lotus 24. But the German Grand Prix was the debut race also of the new Brabham Formula One car, the BT3, finished in turquoise colour. And Jack was there with that, with the Climax V8 engine. Keith Green had a new Gilby powered by a BRM V8 engine. Keith Green, not a name probably that you've heard of, but very, very quick national racing standard driver, very good engineer as well. And later on in life would become team manager of Brabham. Interesting synchronicity there. But he was there at the German Grand Prix in this new Gilby designed by Len Terry, who would go on to achieve major success with Lotus as well. And would join Lotus very soon after the Nürburgring. So lots to talk about going into the German Grand Prix, Ferrari coming in with that 4-car entry, the Nürburgring itself, Porsche doing all that testing, very quick cars being built by Lotus, BRM and Cooper. What was going to happen? Well, what happened was that qualifying was basically confined to a dry session on Friday morning, and after that it just rained and rained and rained. That did nothing to put off the crowd. We talked today about large crowd numbers. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that over 350,000 paying spectators went to the Nürburgring in 1962 to watch that German Grand Prix, and many of them stayed overnight. Horrendous weather. And by race morning, there were landslides and mudslides, and the race was delayed over an hour while that was cleared up. So the grid was very much defined by that early dry session, bearing in mind that in those days, 62, every lap you did in practice on Friday and Saturday was a potential time for the grid. There was no qualifying preceded by untimed practice. Every lap you did was a lap you could do for the grid. And it was Dan Gurney who got the pole in the Porsche. Beautiful lap by Dan. He looked great in the car, sitting quite high in the car, very tall man, but completely at home around the Nürburgring. Unbelievably difficult circuit, dangerous you could say today. But Dan got the car absolutely spot on. But the big drama of that Friday dry session was the accident that involved Count Godin de Beaufort, had a very old Porsche, Graham Hill in a brand new BRM V8, and Tony Maggs in one of the factory Coopers. This has a connection with where we are today, because before that practice session, Count Godin de Beaufort, this genial giant in the orange Porsche, private entrant, was approached by a German TV company who asked him if it would be okay to mount on his car a 16mm cine camera to film the lap of the Nürburgring for their TV show. And Godin de Beaufort said, yeah, absolutely. He was honoured that they chose him. And so the TV crew mounted on this bracket, this 16mm camera. And on Friday, de Beaufort set off. I've got to say at this point, there'd already been a couple of incidents of cameras being mounted on cars and coming a little bit astray and some problems. And there were a few editorials in magazines saying, this is not a good thing. We shouldn't be mixing television and Formula One. And so there is that context, which we should always remember. Some people didn't think this was a great idea. But anyway, he went out and going through a very fast section of road called the Foxhole at Nürburgring. Bear in mind, it's a 10-minute lap. Certainly if you're going to Beaufort. This thing vibrated loose and came off the car. He didn't know that, of course. But there was a camera mounted behind him and it fell into the middle of the track. And not far behind him was Graham Hill, absolutely flat out in the new BRM. And it's an S section of road where you're kind of locked into whatever you're committed to do, blind apices for 4 or 5 corners, slight drift on the car. And as he came around one corner, he just saw this camera or this black object in the middle of the road. And all he could do was straddle it because he knew if he went over with one of the wheels, one of the tyres, a tyre might explode or he might just suddenly turn left or right. So he tried to go over it. And it ripped the oil line out from under the radiator. And oil spewed over the rear wheels of the car. And he had a massive spin and went off into a ditch on the left, well below the road surface. Bear in mind that nobody at that point wore seatbelts in Grand Prix cars. It is unbelievable still to think that Graham Hill escaped from that. Because he, at the time, observers said, must have been doing 140 miles an hour. Graham himself thinks he was doing between 125 and 130 miles an hour. So probably that was more accurate. Massive shunt, high speed. And the new BRM actually had quite a high cowl to it. And that did a little bit of protection of Graham. Open face helmet, of course, goggles. He got out of the car. And initially, he didn't know this, initially a marshal had immediately jumped to the side of the track with an oil flag and a yellow flag, another marshal, and waving the flags like crazy to try and slow the cars down. But after a few seconds, probably 15 seconds or so, the marshal with the oil flag went to try to phone for rescue help and left his post. And Tony Maggs in the Cooper came there, didn't see any flags at all, and went off on the oil, had a massive shunt as well and wrote off the Cooper and had to race a much older car as a result with a 4-cylinder Climax instead of the V8. So huge shunt. In the end, both John Cooper and BRM, Raymond Mays, persuaded or managed to get the TV company to pay for the damage to those 2 cars. But so far as the weekend was concerned, that was a write-off. And Graham Hill had to go to a backup car. Actually, the car with which he'd won the Dutch Grand Prix. So there was a lot of history in that car already. More of that in a minute. And Tony Maggs, as I say, had to race that much older Cooper. So that was the big talking point of practice, of going into this very, very wet German Grand Prix. The other incident before the race, there were 2 incidents really before the race, but this one was truly before the race, was that Bruce McLaren had driven to the race with a New Zealand friend of his who was also entered but didn't actually start the race, Tony Shelley, who was a pretty good average journeyman driver, quite wealthy. And Tony Shelley had a Jaguar 3.8, and with Pat, Bruce's wife, and Tony's wife, the 4 of them drove from the UK to Nürburgring for the race. And Bruce on Sunday morning had his kit, briefcase and everything else in the boot of the 3.8. And it was all nicked. This is parked in the paddock area and everything was nicked. So Bruce had to race in Tony Shelley's helmet and had to go around the paddock borrowing shoes, overalls, all sorts of stuff, and raced in this sort of composite kit. Not very pleasant at all, as you can imagine. And lost his driving license, his passport, everything. You know, in the middle of it's a quadrangle paddock at Nürburgring, and that theft occurred. Terrible. Anyway, the organisers decided that because of the delay and because of the mudslides and because there was a mist coming down and because the rain had eased a little bit, that it would be appropriate to break the normal protocol and give the drivers an opportunity to do one complete reconnaissance lap of the circuit before the race start. Obviously, they had to be topped up with fuel when they got back to the grid. But this was not a normal thing at the Nürburgring. Normally, they just went around the short circuit, did a loop, just and formed up on the grid. Because to do a complete lap, as I say, it's 10, 12 minutes from a standing start. But they did that just to let the drivers have a feel for where the flooded areas on the circuit might be. Bear in mind, no seat belts, and a few of the drivers had visors rather than goggles. But one driver who was racing with goggles was Jim Clark, who had qualified third in the Lotus 25. The car hadn't been running particularly well in the dry, and when it rained, it was obviously, but it was okay then, but it was no way of setting a time. So he was on the front row, P3, it's 4-3-4-3 grid. And on that reconnaissance lap, Jim had quite a lot of problem with the goggles misting up and a bit of water leaking and so forth. And he was faffing around with the goggles when he got back to the starting grid. And in doing so, he completely forgot to switch on the fuel pumps of the Lotus 25. He'd normally, ever since Monaco this year in 62, when the car had been very fluffy in the first couple of laps, he'd always switched off the fuel pumps on the grid just so the thing wouldn't flood, and then switched them on just before the start of the race as the flag was about to be raised. And on this occasion, because he was still faffing around with these goggles, he forgot to switch on the fuel pumps. So when the flag was dropped, he floored the throttle. There was a little bit of fuel left in the carburetors and then nothing. He stalled on the grid. So Jim Clark was basically last going into the first corner by the time he'd twigged and put the fuel pumps back on. So it was a frenetic first few laps. Phil Hill, who hadn't qualified well, he'd been out-qualified by Ricardo Rodriguez, who was effectively driving the fourth Ferrari. Willie Maires would normally have been in that car, but he had that big shunt with Trevor Taylor in the 62 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, was injured, but not massively so, but he still wasn't fit enough to race. So that car was given to Ricardo Rodriguez. It was a 65-degree V6 Dino Sharknose Ferrari. The other three cars for Giancarlo Baghetti, Lorenzo Bandini, and Phil Hill, were all 120 degree, more advanced cars. And indeed, Bandini had what was effectively the 62 upgrade as well. It was the first Ferrari since the beginning of 61 not to have the shark nose. And I will put a picture of that up now because you'll get an idea of what it looked like. Where are we? They're all... Keith Green. Well, there's Keith Green. There you go. In the Gilby, designed by Len Terry with the V8 BRM. You can see the smokestack exhaust. By that stage, the German Grand Prix BRM had got rid of those smokestacked exhausts, which I used to love, and they were down below between the suspension. But where is this? Oh, here's the new. And it's Bandini in the new Ferrari. You can see no shark nose there, and it's a smaller, lighter car. How do they make it lighter? Thinner gauge tube in the space frame chassis. Not particularly the safest thing you can do. But anyway, that was that car. But the quickest in the oldest Ferrari, if you like, with the oldest engine layout, was Ricardo Rodriguez, the younger brother of Pedro, who had a yellow helmet, looked fabulous in the car, and was really, really quick around the Nürburgring. Although Ferrari in general, not that good. So the race, let me just see if there's any other pictures before we go any further that I should be showing you. Here's a picture of Graham Hill. He walked back to the pits. He brought back to the pits with him in the course car after that shunt with the camera. All the film, the cine film and everything. You can see there Jim Clark on the left, Raymond Mays on the right, and Graham Hill looking a bit dazed in the middle. And I've got to say, he did actually suffer quite severe chest bruising and a very sore neck. And later on in his career, he had another accident which affected his neck. And quite often he raced with a neck brace like Nigel Mansell. But Graham there, he looks relatively okay. He's obviously quite concerned, but he's, bear in mind the shunt he had. And then in the next day, he's racing the car, or 2 days later, he's racing the car. Very, very impressive recovery by Graham. Anyway, getting back to the start of the race, Phil Hill from the third row made a pretty good start and was up there amongst the leaders for the first couple of laps. And the leaders were Dan Gurney in the Porsche and the crowd absolutely loving it, Graham Hill, and John Surtees in the Bowmaker Lola Climax. A beautiful car, Eric Broadley, space frame design, very quick car, and driven beautifully by John Surtees, who was already one of the great Nürburgring drivers. So these three very quickly pulled away from the rest of the field, left Phil Hill behind. Jim Clark was forcing his way through the field, very, very difficult in the conditions, the mist and the rain for overtaking, but Clark passed something like 4 or 5 cars on the first lap and was up to 10th place within a lap or two. Quite easy to say a lap or two. Of course, remember, 2 laps is half an hour really, so in those conditions. So it's only a 14 lap race and a very, very long circuit and very difficult for those in the pits. You see them go past and then they go back behind the pits and then you don't see them for 10 minutes. Imagine what that was like for the team owners, just sort of watching the scoreboard and a dotted light bulb coming on what part of the circuit they were at. I remember it well, and it was, it was not an easy, I was there when Nicky had his accident, it was a very spooky pits really, Nürburgring, there's big foreboding grandstands and all the history of the circuit as well. Anyway, after 3 laps, Graham Hill passed Dan Gurney to the astonishment of the crowd and didn't pull away, but he was in front now. So he had no spray to worry about and he had a clear track and he could think about, even though he was hurting a bit, he could think about keeping the car on the island and going as quickly as he could given the conditions. Now, what was going on with Dan Gurney? What had happened with Dan Gurney, if you please, was that one of the mountings for the battery, which was on the left-hand side of the chassis, had come loose. And Dan could feel that as he was driving the Porsche, obviously. He could feel there was something loose. And then he worked out, without having too much time to look down what was going on, that it was the battery. And we're talking the wet here at the Nürburgring. And so he spent about half a lap working out how he could wedge his leg in such a position that it would keep the battery as still as possible and still allow him to use the clutch the way he wanted to use it. And he did the rest of the Grand Prix distance like that, nursing this broken battery mount, but still driving beautifully in the Porsche. I mean, to me, this is one of the great, great Grand Prix performances of all time. Absolutely outstanding. And the interesting thing looking back now is that none. I haven't read any contemporary accounts that mention that at all. Only one mentions the next thing that happened, which was that Graham Hill also felt something rattling around in the cockpit. And I say rattling, you're lying in a semi-reclining position in this space frame BRM V8, and you can feel something's loose. And in his case, it was the fire extinguisher under his legs that was loose and starting to move around. Graham's solution, easier for him to do this than it was for Dan, of course, was actually to reach down and just chuck the fire extinguisher out of the car at a point where he knew it wasn't going to bounce back onto the circuit and get rid of it. And he did that perfectly. Incredible when you think now that what they had to do. Obviously helped a little bit by not having seat belts. They could move around a little bit, but the danger is just something that was not thought about. I mean, Dan's case, can you imagine now the furore if you were racing with a loose battery in that sense, right by the fuel tank, which is also by your legs, and it's wet, and there are sparks potentially all the time. And then Graham with the fire extinguisher. And John Surtees having a relatively calm race of it. And very, very fast and very, very good. Graham Hill started to pull away about 7 seconds with a couple of laps to go. But then thought he saw some oil on the approach to the back straight and backed off, just because what was the point of taking any risk at all? And in backing off, the gap closed right up again. And there wasn't much oil, it appears, because both Surtees and Dan managed to get through it without a problem. And so it was very, very close and very, very tense. But Graham Hill won it. Graham Hill won that German Grand Prix for BRM. One of the great wins I think, of all time, given what happened to him on the Friday, given the conditions. You know, you put this right up with Jackie Stewart's at the Nürburgring in '68 probably, and Nuvolari beating the might of Germany there. And for Graham to have won in physical pain, as he did, was one of the great unsung heroic drives, in my view. Didn't, of course, end there at all. But let's just put the results up, and I'll go through the results as I kind of would if we were doing this as a contemporary Grand Prix. So there you are, August the 5th, 62. First, Graham Hill. Second, John Surtees. Third, Dan Gurney. What a drive in the flat 8 Porsche. Fourth, Jim Clark in the end. Jimmy got up to fourth place, was catching the top 3, but then had a massive moment, 2 massive moments actually, and just decided that he was lucky to have got back to fourth after the mistake he made, and he would continue to finish fourth. And as it happened, his engine started to go off a little bit towards the end, and so he finished fourth. Bruce McLaren, wearing the Tony Shelley helmet, finished fifth for Cooper. And Ricardo Rodriguez, sensational drive in the Ferrari, finished sixth in that 65-degree V6 Ferrari. Now look at that, different make of car in the top 6. We were talking earlier about, is it unique that we're going into a season with no driver changes? I wonder if that's unique. I also need to get Sean Kelly to talk about 6 different cars in the first 6 positions in the race. That shows you how competitive Formula One was back in the early 60s. And of course, that would never happen today. It never happened in a million years. So, you know, enjoy it. Enjoy it now as you're looking at it. Joe Bonnier, 7th in the other Porsche. Pretty good. Richie Ginther was a bit overwhelmed by the conditions in the other BRM, but did okay. Tony Maggs, excellent drive in that old Cooper 55, 4-cylinder Cooper. Giancarlo Baghetti finished 10th. You could say the other final point scorer, if you like, in the 120-degree Ferrari. He'd actually got passed by Godin de Beaufort in front of the pits towards the end of the race, but then de Beaufort promptly spun at the south curve and gave the position back to Baghetti. But for de Beaufort, after what he'd gone through with that thing, and obviously that embarrassing accident, to pass one of the factory Ferraris, pretty good. Ian Burgess, very underrated quick driver in his old Cooper Climax 4, very good to finish 11th. Joe Siffert was running top 6 when he had a problem in his privately entered Lotus 21, still finished 12th, and got, shortly afterwards, was awarded the Von Trips Trophy for Outstanding Independent Driver. And interestingly, he'd just been voted into the GPDA, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, invited by Jim Clark and Joe Bonnier to join. Both of them big fans of Seppi Siffert. So that was a very nice thing. De Beaufort finished 13th in the end, ahead of Heine Walter, who was sort of paying Swiss in the Joe Siffert team, kind of helped make it happen, if you like, in an old Porsche. Nino Baccarella, who was mainly a Targa Florio expert sports car driver, but he was out there in Formula One doing a pretty good job. And Lucien Bianchi, the final finisher, of course, he was the great uncle of Jules Bianchi and the brother of Mauro Bianchi. So, yeah, that was amazing. It didn't all end there because, incredibly, there's some postscripts here. One is that about 2 months later, Bruce McLaren received through the post his wallet, not his passport, but his wallet and a few papers. It looked as if they'd been sitting in the bottom of a ditch for 2 months, which they obviously had. The organisers had sent them on to Bruce. There was nothing there worth keeping, but he did get the wallet back, I suppose you could say. But more significantly, probably, was that on the day after the German Grand Prix, it was Bank Holiday Monday in England, which meant big race meeting at Brands Hatch. And I'm going to have to look at my notes here because there's a number of them that did it. A lot of drivers who were at the German Grand Prix, competing in the German Grand Prix, were racing at Brands Hatch on the next day, including Graham Hill, who had that shunt, won the race, was in pretty bad state, pain, and here he was scheduled to drive 2 cars for John Coombs at Brands Hatch the next day, a Jaguar E-Type and a Jag 3.8. And incredibly, the organisers insisted on all of the drivers in the Grand Prix attending the prize giving, quite correctly, I think. And I like to see that. And when I talk about, third-party commercial rights holders coming in and sort of the tail wagging the dog, these were the days when the circuit organisers ruled the roost. And if they said, you got to stay for the prize giving, or else you won't get your money, you stayed for the prize giving. And so all these drivers, there was Graham Hill, Roy Salvadori, who had driven the second Lola alongside Surtees, John Surtees himself, Jim Clark, Trevor Taylor, Lucien Bianchi and Tony Maggs were all scheduled to be racing at Brands Hatch on the Monday. They had to go to this prize giving, and as Graham Hill remembers it, they took off from Germany at 2:00 in the morning, private aircraft. I mean, in Jim Clark's case, he was flying with Trevor and Colin Chapman's private aircraft, and eventually got to England at who knows what hour, went home, in Graham's case, to Mill Hill, and then straight down to Brands Hatch to race with virtually no sleep whatsoever. And to his credit, Graham actually admits that he made a mistake in the 3.8 when he was having a dice with Mike Parks, I think, and his foot slipped off the brake pedal going into Druids, was wet again, and that was one thing, but that can happen to anyone, I suppose. A metal, the brake pedal wasn't that grippy. But more importantly, he said his reactions were not that good. And he just went straight on into the bank and had another shunt and hurt his neck even more. And then the following week, he was out racing a Lotus 24, would you believe, in Scandinavia. And qualifying sort of middle of the grid. The things they did back then. Tony Maggs, that had that big shunt on the Friday at the Nürburgring and then had to drive the old Cooper and did pretty well, went back to Brands to race a Ken Tyrrell Formula Junior and won the race. Jim Clark went back to drive a Lotus 23. Nothing blew up. And Surtees was pretty good in a 250 GTO. But Mike Parks was the sort of star of that bank holiday Monday at Brands on the Monday after the German Grand Prix. And interestingly, Mauro Fogheri of Ferrari, who was becoming more and more powerful with Carlo Chitti becoming more and more of the guy that had messed up in 62. Mauro was going to take over the development of the Formula One car thereafter. And of course, Chitti was about to leave to go to start his own team, ATS, which was a complete disaster. Mauro Fogheri was at Brands and saw Mike Parks winning all these races. And that's why Mike Parks eventually ended up at Ferrari as a great engineer driver. So that's where it all started for him. There's still more. And I think you're going to like all this. I'll go through it as quickly as I can. But the car with which Graham Hill won that German Grand Prix was chassis number 5781. I've got a nice picture actually of him leading the race. There you see that lovely BRM. That's John Surtees in the Lola behind him, and Dan Gurney slightly off on the left in the Porsche going into the first corner after the pits. And if we go back now to that chassis, that actual chassis, 5781, car designed by Tony Rudd, great engineer, eventually went to Lotus, but there he is with Graham Hill, Tony with the glasses. Tony was the BRM designer who just was as good as anybody out there, I would say, in the history of Formula One in terms of what he's achieved. And you'll see what I mean just looking at these results. So in that actual chassis, that is what Graham Hill did in 1962. Those are all Formula One races. So he had, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 wins in that car, including the Dutch Grand Prix, the German Grand Prix, and the Italian Grand Prix, and went on to win the World Championship in South Africa as well. So look at that. That's amazing. Okay, so that was that. Now look at 63, and the car now has been sold to Centro Sud, which is it was a pretty good race team at the time, an Italian team. It was they did a good professional job, and it was standard procedure in those days to to sell cars and they would still continue to race. Look what happened in '63. Lorenzo Bandini actually got sacked by Ferrari effectively after that German Grand Prix, because he shunted that new car, went off at the carousel, and Ferrari were a bit annoyed and sacked him. So he actually got a drive with Centro Sud in that BRM that Graham Hill had won that German Grand Prix with, and many other races as well. So there's Lorenzo Bandini now, and the car's painted red, colours of Centro Sud. And here he is racing the International Trophy, not doing very much. BRM took it back for Monaco to have a spare car there for Graham Hill, not really used. Graham did drive it, but didn't do much with it. Then the French Grand Prix comes along at Reims, and Lorenzo finishes 10th. So by today's standards, he's in the points. Then the British Grand Prix, qualifies 8th, finishes 5th in this old car. Solitude, which is a wonderful circuit near the Porsche factory, qualifies 10th, finishes 4th. And then you get to the German Grand Prix. Lorenzo Bandini puts the winning car from the year before on the front row of the grid, qualifies 3rd. Okay, went off on the first lap, big shunt with Innes Island. But he out-qualified both of the factory BRMs in that older car, a year older. That's not because the new BRMs were terrible, because they actually form the basis of the very quick BRMs that we saw in 64, 65. It's just that Lorenzo was incredibly good in that car. And that car specifically around the Nürburgring was a really well-balanced, drivable space frame car. Absolutely phenomenal. So look at that. And Lorenzo Bandini, to do that, what happened then? Ferrari said, we've got to have him back now. So we'll have him back in the factory team. And he returned at the Italian Grand Prix driving for Ferrari. So after one more race, which was Enna, where he finished 3rd after qualifying 2nd. That was in Italy in front of the Italian crowd. Then he went back to Ferrari. And the car was then driven for Centro Sud by Maurice Trintignant in the Italian Grand Prix. Finished 9th after not qualifying very well. In the points again, you could say, in today's parlance. And then the last race of 63, it was rented by the Mexican hero, Moise Solana, and he finished 11th with it. Qualified 11th, finished 11th in that exactly the same car. So doesn't end there. Let's look at 64 now. 64, Goodwood, Richard Atwood is driving the car. It's now entered, in this occasion, it's entered by the factory again, the own racing organisation, and he finishes 4th at Goodwood. And then it kind of peters off a little bit. Monaco, French Grand Prix, Maurice Trintignant has now bought the car and it's painted blue and he's racing it with his own people, DNF and P11. But then the German Grand Prix comes along, Nürburgring, Maurice Trintignant in his blue BRM, chassis 5781, finishes 5th. Unbelievable. And then finally, it did actually appear in 65 as well. Not much to speak of in terms of results, but look at the drivers who sat in it in 65. Chris Amon, and also Maston Gregory and Giancarlo Baghetti. So, pretty amazing stuff, I think. I'm trying to see, I'm going to look at my notes now to see if I've got any more that I need to say about this race, because it was one of the amazing Grand Prix, I think. Battery, visor. Oh, they're all on the same tyres as well. I didn't make that point. And I make that point because sometimes in the wet, Jackie Stewart's case in 68, the Dunlop wets were much better than the Firestone wets, for example. The Firestone wets were never very good. And the Dunlops were a big advantage. But on this occasion, 62 German, everybody was on Dunlop D12s. Everybody in the race had the same tyres. So no tyre issues at all. So there we are. Hope you enjoyed that. 62 German Grand Prix. And now back to normal, shall I say? Let's go to some other questions. How do I do this? I've forgotten how to do it all now. No, I won't do that. I go to your questions here. Michael Delorso says, pretty good question, I think. I think we all want to know this, don't we? When can Formula One move beyond pay drivers and put the best athletes in like any other sport? How much money is enough? Well, yeah, exactly. Budget cap, year of the budget cap, era of the budget cap. Yeah, right. It's still unbelievably expensive to go motor racing. I mean, look at the way the rest of the motorsport has gone in Europe anyway, outside Formula One. It's all subsidized by rich drivers and or rich friends stroke relatives of drivers. I'm talking particularly of sports car racing, endurance racing, and to some extent F3 and F2, although obviously there are occasionally talented guys who can get the money together and who don't get the money together, but the money is sort of provided and there's a lot of impetus, so they just happen to hit the right sweet spot. And I think that's the case with Kimi, the new guy that Mercedes have signed, and he's going straight into Formula 2 from regional. So that's a good example of that, I guess. But in general, yeah, it's very difficult because you're not talking small sums of money. You're talking 8-9 million, even to get potentially a toe in the door, let alone more than that. And it's until Formula One has a proper system. Well, let me come back to another thing that I always used to rave on about, and which I still think is current today. And that is that, yes, Formula One teams have kind of taken over the role of driver management on behalf of everybody else. And so therefore, for a third party athletic management company to come in and do a good job in Formula One is virtually impossible because the power is with the teams. If you're a young guy and you've got potentially Red Bull saying, yeah, we want you as a young academy driver, or you've got some sports management agency saying, oh, we want to sign you as a driver and help you find money, what are you going to do? You're going to go to Red Bull, aren't you? That's not the case in other sports. Big management companies exist and they do a very good job in football, golf, tennis, wherever it is. But in Formula One, the power has always been with the teams. So let's accept that now. And I made this point years ago to IMG that they should basically set up a team in order to crack Formula One as a sports management agency. But they said, oh, we're not in the business of running a team, so forget it. But it's a mistake. I think they should have done it at a time when it was still relatively easy to do. And the point I'm getting around to making is that all the Formula One teams actually do have the wherewithal to help young drivers raise money for their racing, whether it be regional Formula 3, whether it be FIA Formula 3 or Formula 2. And they don't do a very good job of that. They kind of have chosen drivers that they might promote and steer into a seat. But if you are genuinely a driver with absolutely zero money and you don't have a great opportunity to show your talent because you haven't got a lot of money, there's absolutely no way you can become part of that system because the team's not going to sign you in the first place. And what I'm really getting around to saying is that if you take any racing environment, whether it's Formula 2, Formula 3, Formula 1, whatever it is, and you're trying to find sponsorship to pay the bills, you need good people who are very good at procuring sponsorship, in looking at the marketplace and getting out there and selling the asset. And you need very, very good people to finish that deal and make it happen, and potentially to build in a few other assets to polish it all over. You need a compliant team, in other words. And the teams have all that. They have the people, they have all the facilities they need in terms of hospitality at races, in terms of presentation, in terms of freebies for potential sponsors, but they don't use it in the way that it can really be used if it was a proper sports management agency in its own right, because they're too focused on what they're doing, racing anyway. And I think it's a crying shame. I really do, because if you talk about the average driver in, say, British Formula 3, GB3, who's pretty good, he's won a couple of races and he's spent his, whatever he's spent, 200,000 or 300,000 a year or maybe more, and then he's got to find 1 million to do Formula 3 really well. It's almost impossible to do that because Formula 3 FIA doesn't have enough TV coverage to justify any company in the world spending that sort of money. There are too many other things they can do that are good value. But if that driver was given sort of free rein with a good manager, with the facilities of an F1 team, and all the connections that come with that, and all the bolt-ons, the Formula One hospitality, the Formula One gold-plated paddock pass and all the other stuff you can use, there's a good chance you would find that money. But they don't do it. And well, I keep using the word shame. It's a shame. It's a shame that IMG, who at the time I approached them were the world's biggest sports management agency, didn't take my advice and start a Formula One team. We're going back 20, 30 years now. And it was a time when you could do that. And they would have all the power if they did that. Because once you've got the team, then you can start having the team of drivers, then you can build up the education process for the drivers, and you can start selling the drivers on if you can't find a slot for them and so forth. Zach Brown is kind of doing that better than anybody else, I think, at the moment. But it's still pretty difficult and exclusive to come in and plug in and use all of McLaren's resources. And you'd be, don't approach this company because we're already in contract with that company and it's competition. You've got to put all that to one side. Sorry, keep getting these messages coming through WhatsApp. I don't know why. Somebody normally never WhatsApp has just sent 3 in a row. And so that's the reason. And how much money is enough money? I was thinking today about the budget cap. Until they get rid of those ridiculous motorhomes they all have for the European races, I won't take them seriously when they tell me that they're trying to reduce costs. When it comes to putting in essential things to the sport, like spare cars for a start, and a few other things as well. Maybe opening up the paddock a bit more to Formula 2 and Formula 3, and maybe making it less difficult to sell motorsport if you're outside Formula 1. This is, very annoying. I don't know how. I've turned off the audio for the thing, still making a noise. Anyway, there we are. So that's an answer to that question. Thank you very much indeed, Michael, for that. Long answer, as ever, on that one. So another question here. I better just check to see whether any super chats or whatever. Oh yeah, here's one from Philip Goncalves. Thank you very much indeed, Philippe Goncalves. Okay, putting this one up. Where are we? So I never know what the question is really until I've done all this stuff, and it's always a bit of a heart-in-mouth moment. Philip Goncalves, thank you very much indeed, Felipe. Peter, talk a little bit more about the difference in styles in terms of front end or rear end comparing Lewis and Max. And is that correct to affirm that Lewis prefers front end cars? Yeah, I've talked about this before, but no problem to talk about it again. I don't know of a great Grand Prix driver, whether it be Lewis, Max, Sterling Moss, Jim Clark, Michael Schumacher, Charles Leclerc, who doesn't want a good front end. It depends. When you see all these quotes coming from drivers, quite often it's dependent very much on the context and the question they've been asked. But I don't know of any great Grand Prix driver that's never wanted a good front end. And the difference between a great Grand Prix driver and a very good Grand Prix driver who's still capable of winning races in the right car is their ability to handle the back end of the car. That is the point. And so long as Max Verstappen's got a front end, he can live with whatever the back's going to do, basically within reason. Sergio Perez can't. Jenson Button couldn't. And so that is the defining thing. And I would say between Lewis and Max, there is absolutely no difference in what they want from a car. Lewis wants a front end. And if he's got a front end, he can do the rest of it. Thank you very much. And so can Max. So there you go. It's as simple as that. And so when people complicate it by saying, oh, does he like understeer or oversteer or rear end, front end? It's not that. It's in another context, it's 185 mile an hour blind right-hander with the crosswind blowing pretty fiercely, and there's a gap between the trees where the crosswind hits you mid-corner, and you know that corner is flat, that kink is flat, and you got to do it. It's those guys like Lewis and Max and Charles who know that providing they've got the front end, they can live with whatever the back's going to do when the crosswind hits it. Not many other drivers on a Formula One grid can think that way. but they do. And that is what it's all about. Ultimately taken to its ultimate extreme. Obviously, I'm creating an example that doesn't exist in today's world, but that is it. You need a front end. I mean, I think if they don't have a great front end and the cars have got a lot of understeer, obviously a Max, a Lewis or a Charles is going to be able to do more with that car than any other driver on the grid, really, because they've got the subtlety and the touch to be able to massage and reduce the downside of the understeer as much as possible. Jarno Trulli, for example, was absolutely hopeless at driving with understeer, but very, very good if he had a good front end. Jean Alesi, another good example of that. Jensen too, but Lewis. I mean, what makes it difficult, I think, for observers is that when Lewis has understeer, you don't actually see it because he's already massaging it. He's massaging the shape of it, and George doesn't do that quite as well. And when you notice the difference between George and Lewis, it's more when they've got a handling problem like that. And it's the same with Max. You know, Max will come in and say, "Oh, the car's terrible. It's doing this. It's doing that." And we watched him on the lap, and it looks perfect. It's all because of the inputs. The rate of input is absolutely perfectly in sync with what the car's doing, and he's not reacting to anything that the car's doing. He's creating the force that he's manipulating, and that's the difference. So, you know, Max may say in a macho moment, "Nah, I don't need a front end," but you don't believe him. He would want a front end more than anything else in the world, and then he can live with whatever else you want to throw at him. Sorry, I've got to move this way now. So there we go. Thank you for that. Right, next question. Where are we at? 9 o'clock. Time flies. Probably spent too much on the 62 German Grand Prix, didn't I? Hope not. Hope you enjoyed it. Well, it's a lot of questions come in now. A lot. I wonder if there's anything coming at the end here of interest. Well, this one's kind of relevant to what I was just talking about. Never fear those in the middle, but I am sort of coming in from the bottom now, just as a change, just to sort of see how it goes. Because this question, I've just happened upon it, is quite relevant to what we were just talking about, I think. Let's have a look. Well, it's quite a long question. Let's have a look. I hope it all fits on the page. That's the only reason I'm slightly nervous. Okay, let's have a look. Poof, poof. There we go. Yeah, it all works. Owen, I think it is the young age of Max that makes him able to react on the behaviour of the rear end, just like Jimmy Johnson compared to Mark Martin in the Sprint Cup in 2009. Peter, talk a little bit more about the difference in styles in terms of front end and rear end, comparing Lewis and Max, and is that correct to affirm Lewis preferred? Well, you did that, so I'm just adding that you've added that bit at the beginning. I think, you know, as my memory of that Jimmy Johnson, Mark Martin thing was that Mark was, and I may be wrong here because I'm not a NASCAR expert by any means, but I think Mark was sort of kind of been racing for quite a long time by then, and obviously what I just described, that 185 mile an hour kink with the crosswind, once you get beyond a certain age and you're racing because you're in a good car, but you're not going to take a million risks, I think that's the moment when maybe you do back off a little bit. So I'm not saying that age doesn't come into it at some point. Obviously it does. I don't think Lewis is at that point. I think Lewis's point is that if the car doesn't feel great, he's not going to be massively on top of it. If the car's great and he's got a good front end, Lewis is still going to be as quick as anybody in the world, in my opinion. But I think what you saw there with Mark Martin versus Jimmy Johnson was yeah, absolutely flat through the kink, no problem. Mark Martin thinking, if this crosswind is big as I think it is, I better leave a little bit of margin. I hope I'm not doing Mark Martin a misjustice there, because he's a big Jim Clark fan, isn't he? Which is brilliant. always been a Mark. I've never met Mark, but I'm sure he's a really good guy. If he's a Jim Clark fan, he's got to be, isn't he? Anyway, there we go on that one. Thank you. And that was you. That was the same question, I think, wasn't it? So basically, it's amazing how I managed to find that one just like that. Where are we at now? YouTube, I've forgotten. Here we go. So Destruction says, makes sense. I assume Lewis preferred understeer, but yeah, if the front does what he wants, then that's great. But I wondered if Lewis would like the RB19. Of course he'd like the RB19 because it's a massive level of grip at the front and the rear, wherever he wants it. And it looks like the sort of car where you can basically trim it and set it up how you like, really. It looks like it responds to everything you do, as distinct from the Mercedes, which does the opposite to what you set it up to do. Okay, Rens van de Ploeg. This is a very emotional question for me to answer, a little bit anyway. Put this up. So, you were involved in starting a new team back in the days. How do you compare that to Andretti of today? What is the difference of the same? Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly was twice actually, but the last time it was as today, room for 26 cars on the grid. Nobody was showing any interest in trying to fill those places. And David Richards had been granted granted the slot for a new team, which he was going to run year-old McLarens, I think. And when the FIA said, "Oh no, you can't do that. You got to do your own car," he pulled out straight away, and nobody complained. Everybody thought, "Oh well, that's that." But it was an indication that if you did come up with a reasonable package and you did your own cars, there was something you could do. And I with my colleagues in America, Ken Anderson particularly, a very good guy who worked for Penske dampers and very good engineer. Johnny Rutherford always spoke very highly of him as well, and a lot of Indy people did. I mean, a really good guy. And he used to badger me that there was incredible technology corridor in the east coast of the States there, basically from Charlotte down to Daytona. And if we used that, you could certainly design and build a Formula One car there. There was enough technology to do it. And there was the full-scale wind shear wind tunnel there too, which wouldn't hurt. Obviously, you'd base the team in Europe, but it would be a team that you could actually say this car is made in America, and we call the team USF1. And we love that idea of it being an American car with that made in America badge. And we felt that there was half a reasonable chance, because it was America, of getting a reasonable engine deal. And so we went about it. And sure enough, people liked it. And we got pretty good support behind the project very quickly, going back to 2009 now. And I remember Max Mosley, the president of the FIA at the time, ringing to say, "This is amazing, Peter. What a great idea. Well done. Congratulations. This is brilliant. Any help we can give you, let us know. We really love to see this team on the grid. And good luck." So that was that. And I then literally, I remember Bernie rang and said, "Peter, I've got Luca Montezemolo on the phone. Talk to him, Luca." And basically Luca said, "Peter, we'd like to supply you with Ferrari engines. Ferrari North America, love this idea. Let us know how it's going. We really want to sit down and do a deal." So that was great news as well. And so we started. And then about 7 weeks later, I got a phone call from Bernie saying, "Oh, Peter, put the brakes on. Not going to happen the way you thought. Your plan has triggered an idea in the minds of me and Max, and we're going to create a whole new class in Formula One around the sort of team that you want to do, cheap car." I said, "Well, it's not a cheap car, Bernie. It's just that if you do it in America, it's sort of 40% less expensive than doing it in the middle of Oxfordshire or Modena. America's a relatively cheap place to build a car. That's all." "Oh, well, anyway, put that to one side. Anyway, forget the Ferrari deal. You got to buy Cosworth engines now, 7 million or whatever it was, 7 million, and we want the deposit, 50% in 3 weeks." I said, "Well, why? Why have we got to do that?" "Oh, well, that this new car, this new category, you got to have the Cosworth engine." So I knew what was going on then. And obviously Max had gone back to his mates and said, Windsor's doing this car, thinks he can do it for this amount of money. Is this feasible? And they'd all said, well, if you do it in America, yeah, but why let those clowns do it? We should be allowed to race as well. And so all these people came out of the woodwork and started saying, oh, we can do a cheap team as well. And so Bernie and Max created this thing, this budget cap formula, 30 million budget limit, ridiculous, and announced that it would be racing in 2010. And we would not now be given our Concord Agreement entry until back end of 2009. And of course, for the backers we had, it was like, well, are you guys doing this team or not? And we said, well, until we're in the Concord Agreement, we're not going to get out there and spend any money or do anything because we can't guarantee we're going to be racing even. Well, so we waited and waited and waited. And here I'm getting to the point of what is the difference between us and Andretti, because eventually, we were given a slot and it was like October. And we were told we had to be racing the following year with the car fully crash tested. We hadn't even got a factory. Our plan always was to do a 3-year project, build the factory, build the car, go testing, start slow, go racing in the normal way, as everybody did, as Frank Williams did when he started, everybody. But we weren't given that opportunity. We had to do it all in 6 months. Absolutely ridiculous. So we lost everything. That was it. So the big difference is, if Michael does it, absolutely for sure, he'll be given the right time frame to prepare the car and do everything correctly, probably for 2026, I'm guessing. So yeah, but that's it. Nothing more, nothing less. He'll be given the time frame. We weren't. And if I sound a bit bitter about it, I am, because I think, it was Bernie and Max at their very, very worst. And of course, that whole thing was just used as leverage because Bernie was trying to get the top teams to sign a new Concord Agreement. And he kept saying, well, if you don't sign it, I'm going to make this new budget cap formula the whole new world championship. You can go and do your own thing. That was what he was trying to do. And of course, they did all sign. And then as soon as it happened, we were all flushed down the toilet. A couple of teams that had come out of the woodwork, like Braun, not Braun, but, to some extent, Braun, I suppose. They all kind of on the back of, not Braun's a bad example, Campos and what was the other one, HRT and all that lot. They all going to fail because they were competing on ridiculously small budgets against Formula One teams, which is why they all failed. And in the case of one of them, it was at I can't remember now, but one of them was using Dallara cars anyway. So, it wasn't even a complete car that they were doing. We were going to do our own car, our own race car from America. So there we are. I'm not crying. I'm just, So there you go. A lot more to it than that, obviously. I'm going to read some of these out now because I want to get through them quite quickly. Bad Kuznia Dram. Do you think that net zero CO2 is just greenwashing in Formula One? They still produce tons of waste like many used tyres every race or drivers flying around the world in private jets. I'll put this up actually. I'm not the world's expert, as you probably would guess, on all of this. The only thing I know is that whenever anybody says this about in any sport or activity, whether it be a rock concert or a sport, the reply comes back in the defense of the asset, the sport or the rock concert, that the worst pollution is all caused by all the fans that fly around watching the race anyway or going to the sports event. So, nothing wrong with Formula One. It's all the fans that cause all the pollution. I don't know. I don't know. I think, I have to say, I think Stefano Domenicali does a very good job. Shame he's not, I hope one day he's president of the FIA because I think he'd do a very good job in that role. And I think he knows what he's doing and he's very bright in that area. Well, in all areas, but he's particularly bright in that area. But I don't think those huge European motorhomes send a great message out in terms of net zero. And you're right, the flying around business and the crazy logistics of the championship aren't very good either, are they? So it's obviously a compromise from beginning to end. And Formula One likes to think that it's doing a very good job in terms of the way it's developing its engines and its technology. But again, I would say I don't think Formula One does a very good job of selling its technology to the general public to the point where they actually understand it and love it and talk about it, and it propagates around the world. I think they love to keep it a big, deep, dark secret because it's cool to do that. And I mean, you see it, don't you? You see Williams stopping out on the circuit, Logan Sargent, and the car's being lifted up onto the flat top, and there are photographers around, and the marshals are pushing them away, and the mechanics are trying to put covers over it. I mean, give me a break. So Williams, for Pete's sake, I mean, it's not as if it's winning the world championship. What secrets are there that, you know, they're trying to hide? And I think that, okay, it's good for the show, but I think it's carried to a ridiculous extreme. And we need to be much more open with the technology. And you know, in the media, you get press releases from the teams all the time. When something goes wrong, occasionally they mention the technical problem on the car. Well, why don't they tell us what it was? You know, was it a camshaft follower? Was it a broken stud on the left front suspension? Was it a fly-by-wire issue on the brakes? Or why don't they tell it? Because it's interesting stuff that they can tell the public, and we can tell a story about how the team have solved that problem for the benefit of the sport and the world in general, instead of just these ridiculous things, you know, technical problem prevented him from going out and all this rubbish. I find it really annoying. And I've said before, you know, I've only got to think of the thrill in the eyes of Colin Chapman when he would talk about a problem and how he solved the problem, because he wanted people to understand what he did and how he got out of bed in the morning. And Formula One is about that. Formula One is about problem solving, and yet the problem solving is never sold to the public. Never. All we're supposed to love is all the froth and stuff at the top, and you know, all the bubbly stuff that doesn't have any real meaning or force. And that's a great shame, because Formula One goes out of its way to have its own DNA to ensure that if you enter the World Championship, you've got to design and build your own car, unless you're called Dallara. With Haas, and you can do it that, and so it's a shame that Formula One doesn't do more. I think, great shame. Pharaoh Gamma, who is the Red Bull number 2 driver after Checo? Liam Lawson, maybe. Who have they got? Ford, haven't they? Yeah, I don't think that will require them having absolutely for sure having an American, in the same way that the Honda deal meant that they had to have a Japanese car in the AlphaTauri, a Japanese driver. So yeah, Liam Lawson's got to be in with a chance, hasn't he? I would hope. I don't think Yuki Tsunoda. He's driven pretty well the last few races, I have to say. I mean, so that we shouldn't completely count him out, but I doubt it. They will probably go for somebody, I don't know. Lando would do a pretty good job, wouldn't he? Lando would be pretty much their perfect driver, because they probably think he's not quite as quick as Max, but he's very capable of winning Grand Prix and taking up the slack, if there is any, that Max leaves. So I would say, if I was Marco and Christian, I'd be thinking of talking to Lando. Who else? I don't think Daniel. I think they probably think he's not quick enough now, but really good bloke to have in the car, very good to have in the sim and all the rest of it, but not probably quick enough to be in the other car. He says, you know, with Perez there, he's probably at least as good as Perez, if not better, but you know, I just don't see it. To me, I just don't think he'll go back there, or they'll have him back. Yeah, I'd say Lando's the guy that I would go for. It doesn't mean much, I suppose, but he's the most logical driver to have alongside Max, I think. Arsene Martins says, even karting at junior level is expensive. Costs at least £75,000 a year. Only the wealthy will be able to put up that amount. Absolutely. It's completely ridiculous. And Formula One, like all the other the European forms of motorsport, always think that there's somebody else who'll come along and pay the bill. That's inherited from Bernie, that attitude. And I think it's appalling. I think we should do all we can. Everything we do in the sport should be orientated towards making it as easy as possible for young, talented drivers to find money, to learn how to find money. And all the Formula One teams should have sponsorship acquisition divisions that are an arm's length away from their current sponsors on the Formula One car, and enable young drivers to go out and use their initiative and create sponsorship packages. It's absolutely crazy, the amount of money that is asked for and demanded, and sometimes demanded up front. You can't even drip feed a team and base it on performance. Oh no, we need the money up front. Then you get the money up front, and after 4 races, oh, we've lost our other sponsor. We need more money. I haven't got any more money. Oh well, you're out. And I'm not going to mention the team, but I heard from a father of a young driver that this team, which has one of these F1 driver academies, which most of the people who fill the slots are all paying to fill the slots. If they do find a young karter who's got an enormous motorhome, in other words, an enormous amount of money behind him, and he's also quite quick, they sign him up, and then they basically say, we want you in, one of the top F3 teams. It's got to be, Carlin or Prema or whatever, one of the best teams. And the father, who's spent all his money really in karting, then has to pay a little bit more to go for the extra mile with the team. But then he's got a little bit of money coming in from the F1 team, a little bit, not a lot, but it's enough to put the colour on the car and the overalls, and the young kid feels good. But then the team goes to the Formula 3 team and takes a commission for introducing the driver. Basically get their money back. Richard Hinton, one of my dear friends. Let me see what he's got to say. I'm sure it's going to be a difficult but very penetrating question. Knowing old Richard. Where are we? Richard Hinton, in case you don't know him, is an amazing entrepreneur of wonderful afternoon, summer get-togethers of basically Lotus fans. But I call Lotus fans people that love Formula One racing and anything to do with Formula One, because if you like Lotus, that happens, doesn't it? Lotus are Formula One. Bit biased, but anyway, Richard Hinton, even at the lowest club level, any motorsport now is for very rich people only. When I was 21, it was affordable enough for me to race Mini 7 on a bottom rung salary. Today, it is absolutely impossible. Well, that's very sad, isn't it? Very sad. Makes me think, actually, Mini 7, that race I was talking about on Bank Holiday Monday after the German Grand Prix 62, who was the fastest Mini driver around Brands Hatch in the wet? And who was sensationally good after being punted out on the first lap in driving back through the field and finishing third in class in the Mini? Christabel Carlisle, very, very attractive and fast female racing driver. So good. That was a Christabel Carlisle special day, that one, that Bank Holiday Monday. But thanks for that, Richard. Mini 7, yeah, wow. Cody Ganson. I've got something else I'm going to talk about in a second as well. A couple of things, actually. But we'll put this one up. Cody Ganson. Hey, Peter, out of all all-time Formula One drivers, where would you put Kimi? I was thinking about Kimi yesterday, wondering what he's doing and what he looks like, and if he's actually this Christmas sort of sitting around the fire with his kids on his lap and decorations everywhere, or whether he's out jet skiing or skiing. I don't know. Be interesting to know with Kimi, and probably doing something crazy. Yeah, it depends what Kimi you're talking about. If you're talking about the Kimi in the McLaren era, I would say, yeah, I'd put him up there with Achille Vazzi and Emerson Fittipaldi. I think he was sensationally good, very good at massaging issues in a car, understeer, graining, very good, very quick, and very simple, uncomplicated approach. And I'm not in any way saying he wasn't intelligent. He is intelligent. All I'm saying is, like Max, he had that ability to be very simple about what he needed in order to be quick. And I think he found it quite frustrating, the more and more data and telemetry that came into Formula One, and he just wasn't interested in it, and it kind of got away from him. Plus, I think behind the scenes, he didn't keep himself as fit as he should have, even though he had one of the best trainers ever, Mark Arnold, who is still... I take my hat off to Mark the number of years he did with Kimi, because he couldn't have been an easy guy to work with, but Mark's a really good physio. But yeah, I think he was good. I'm not being stupid when I say as good as Varzi. I mean, Varzi was really good, and like Kimi, he had a few issues behind the scenes as well, and so that's why I make the comparison. Emerson had no issues behind the scenes, other than that he had this sort of Brazilian heritage thing, that he was the father figure and wanted to create this Brazilian Formula One team, which became quite a big distraction for him. But when he wasn't distracted, Emerson was unbelievably quick, and I think he drove in a pretty similar way to Kimi as well. I can't really speak for how Varzi drove, but observers will say that he was pretty much like Kimi, pretty much straight lines everywhere, and very, very good on power application compared with some of the other guys that you saw in auto unions, you know. So yeah, or Bugattis for that matter. So very good. I mean, there's so many great drivers, so many, absolutely. Dan Gurney is another that springs to mind, I guess, in a way. A little bit like Kimi in terms of his talent, that, you know, he had distractions, which was, in Dan's case, was the engineering and the car and the team, and sometimes that probably affected him as a driver, but unbelievably quick as a driver. And Kimi had his distractions as well, as we saw later on. Anyway, the thing that I wanted to talk about now was leading up to Christmas. I was just thinking about Kimi around the Christmas tree, made me think of this. It's just come in. Look at this. Jim Clark collection, triple pack, Scale Extric Legends. Mega, love it. Good on Scale Extric. Jimmy was, when Scale Extric was around in you know, first came out in the early 60s, Jimmy was out there doing the racing with Graham Hill and others, and there you see it. It's Lotus 25, Lotus Cortina, and Lotus 49. The only thing I'd say about that, I don't know if you can see it there, the Lotus 25, car number 1, he's actually got he's got the dark blue helmet, which is fine, but he's actually got a dark blue peak on the helmet as well, which is kind of odd, because unless somebody else can correct me here, I don't remember Jimmy having a dark blue peak on his helmet driving a Lotus 25 stroke 33 other than that at Zandvoort in 64. The rest of the time in the 25 and 63 he had no peak at all after the Belgian Grand Prix 62, and then in 64 he had a white peak, Leston helmet. And so I find it odd that, and he certainly wasn't car number 1 in the Dutch Grand Prix, 18 I think, 64. So it's odd that they've got that number 1, but he's got a dark blue peak on the helmet. Other than that, great to see. Now, there's another thing. Very good friend of mine, artist friend of mine, got a lot of time for him. Michael Turner has always been one of my dearest friends and a great artist as well. Christmas cards, and his son as well, Graham. But another artist that I really like is Martin Tomlinson. And I'm going to read a letter that he sent by email. It was about a piece I did on the live stream a couple of weeks ago. He said, I thought your recent live stream comments concerning building replica racetracks was spot on. Also of interest were your thoughts on why circuits should have some more testing corners to sort out the men from the boys, which is a point I made. You know, it's one thing to have all these straights and DRS zones and all this overtaking and everybody saying, oh, what a great race. But where were the demanding corners, was my point. And then Martin goes on to say, I once read a piece written by Dennis Jenkinson in Motorsport, Jenks, DSJ, the doyen of British journalists, in which he theorised something similar to the following. On a track where there was a 50 to 60 mile an hour maximum speed corner, virtually all of the grid would be able to find its limit. Further down the road, there was another bend with a limit of 120, 130 miles an hour. Not all of the grid would be capable of attaining this. Further down the track still was a flat-out bend which could be taken at 180 miles an hour, but only a few of the grid would be capable or want achieving that. Actually, it's what I've just been saying. I had no idea that he referred to that here. I've got to put my hand up and say that, and that's interesting, isn't it? Because I was talking about that 185 mile an hour kink. If this is the case, then surely the speed differential, but this is Martin talking now. If this is the case, then surely the speed differential between those that can and those that aren't capable of finding the limits on the faster bends would enable the faster drivers to overtake the slower ones on the following straights without the need of any artificial aids, DRS. This would also mean that the current point and squirt street circuits could be bulldozed, leaving sufficient room for some proper circuit replacements. Replicas, as you suggest, Peter. Yeah, and I think he's absolutely right. You know, if we had a demanding corner on every circuit, we wouldn't need DRS. That's another point. Yeah, very good. Anyway, Martin, I just want to show you some of his recent work, right? This is, that's what I say, I love his stuff. Let's have a look at this. This is a, where are we? This is a painting he's done of Graham Hill, Monaco 68, going past Chatham's Bar up before Casino Square, where Graham used to go a lot. And he did that, I'm told, or Martin tells me, it was a commission for a friend who did a lot of marshalling in the 60s, circuit marshalling, and who was, and I found this really interesting, a gopher stroke helper for Bob Anderson in Formula One. Bob was a private entrant, a little bit like Go Down to Beaufort. He had a Brabham and was very good in 66. Won the Rhodesian Grand Prix from memory, and sadly lost his life testing, I think 67, beginning of 67, but he was good. And Jenks used to rate him as well. Did very well in a few races. I think he finished top 3 in the Austrian Grand Prix, 64, I think, maybe. I don't know. I can't remember. Anyway, that was done for that. And I thought there was a nice link there that he did that painting for this gentleman. Then let's have a look at this. I'd completely forgotten this. This is Fangio in the BRM V16. I hadn't forgotten that Fangio was one of the drivers. What I'd forgotten was that in 1953, which was the second year of the weird Formula 1 World Championship, 52 and 53, was dominated by Ascari in the Ferrari, the little 2-litre Ferrari, when the regulations were basically for Formula 2. And the 53 British Grand Prix, duly won by Ascari. But after the Grand Prix, they had a Formula Libre race, Libre, for big cars. And Fangio finished second in that race in the BRM V16. I'd completely forgotten that. The race was won by Farina, interestingly enough. And I think a Ferrari was third as well. I'm not sure who drove it, but so Fangio split the Ferraris in Maseratis. He would have been in Maserati. Sorry, Farina would have been in a Maserati, and Fangio was second in the V16 BRM. And there he is, and that's what I like about Martin's work. He takes his obscure races and does this amazing history on them. This is in the yellow, lovely yellow suit, yellow polo shirt, I guess. I'm not sure it had a collar. Tazio Nuvolari in the beautiful V12 Alpha 12C 1936. This was a Scuderia Ferrari car. You can see the Ferrari prancing horse there on the side. This is Aurelio Lampredi at his very best. And the same car that Nuvolari would have used to won the 36 Vanderbilt race at Long Island in America. And here, this is in Hungary, at Nepliget Park in Hungary, when he did another of his giant killing acts and killed, if you like, the Mercedes and Auto Union opposition, who were quite tight circuit, and those big Mercs and Auto Unions were sliding all over the place. Difficult to drive. Varzi was very good that day, but Nuvolari in the Alpha was just phenomenal. And I love that picture of him. I think it's a great picture, actually. It's one of my favorite pictures of Martin's work. So there we are. And then Alberto Ascari, how about that? Normally when people choose to picture Ascari with his light blue helmet and overalls, they choose one from his championship years, 52, 53. But this is actually 51. And there's a lot of, you probably recall that Ferrari's first Grand Prix victory was the 51 British Grand Prix, the 4.5 litre Ferrari. Well, the next race was the German Grand Prix, which Ascari won in the Ferrari. So he won Ferrari's second World Championship Grand Prix. Isn't that a beautiful picture? He went on to win at Monza as well. Lovely shot of Ascari going through the carousel. You don't see many shots from 51. I say shot, images, if that's the right word. So that's the work of Martin Tomlinson. And I'll put his website, which I think is called motor-racing-art.co.uk, but I'll put that into the description below this video. So, yeah, there we are. Lots of other stuff going on. Let's have a look now. Nearly at time, but not quite. I was going to say here's a Gandalf the Fool says, thanks for the race review, Peter. Great effort. Love it. Thank you very much, Gandalf. Very kind. But you're biased probably, you know. This one is, I saw Toto Wolff up there and I thought it was somebody commenting about my comments about the current brouhaha to do with the compliance dramas. But it's not. It's Aiden Power 100 says, do you think Toto Wolff will be under pressure next year if the car isn't competitive? Well, I think the short answer to that is that he owns so much of the team now that I don't think it really matters what happens, does it? I don't think the Mercedes board could fire him or anything like that because I think he owns a large percentage of it. He'll basically do what he wants. I think. Maybe you're wrong. I'm not sure. I'm not privy exactly to the percentage of shares he owns. But assuming that he still has to report to the Mercedes board for the deal he wants with the engines and everything else, and the finance that comes from Merck, then absolutely, for sure, yeah. I'm sure, as I've always said in the past, Toto Wolff's greatest talent, a little bit like Christian Horner's talent, has been keeping Adrian Newey happy all these years to the point where he's just doing a brilliant job for Red Bull year after year after year. Adrian Newey and his team. A little bit along those lines, I've always said that the great talent of Toto Wolff actually is that he's able to stand up in front of the Mercedes board and get more money out of them every year or whatever it is he needs from them every year, because that can't be an easy thing to do. And he does it. And he's obviously a very, very good salesman in that respect. So whether he can continue to do that, because he's got two phenomenal racing drivers, if they have another terrible year and they don't win a race, can he continue to get their support? Probably. He seems to be pretty Teflon coated, doesn't he? So I'm sure he'll come out of this current one, this thing about, compliance. I'm sure he'll come out of that okay. So I think it's a bit of as ever, there's a bit of inter-chat going on, which is good because then I'm not losing too much. Yeah, how many laps did they run at the Nürburgring? I think it was 15. One thing I didn't check actually was how long I'm just going to duck down here 1 second. How long that German Grand Prix was. That's an interesting point, isn't it? Because in the wet, that must have been a very, very long race. I don't think they shortened it, which they would have done in today's world for sure. Let's have a look. See if it has the time here. Here's the race time. Graham Hill's race winning time of the German Grand Prix, 62, 2 hours, 38 minutes, 45.3 seconds. It's got 80.4 next to it. I can't believe the average speed was 80.4 miles an hour, but I suppose it was, which is amazing still, isn't it? 2 hours, 38 minutes. What a race. What a win. And I mentioned Graham Hill driving a Lotus 24 a week later. He did the Brands Hatch Monday, and then literally the following week, the 5th of August is the race, and the 12th of August he's in Karlskoga, Sweden, driving a Lotus 24 for Rob Walker, qualifying 5th behind Surtees, Innes Island, Joe Bonnier and Roy Salvadori, and retiring with an oil leak after 11 laps. Unbelievable, isn't it? It's unbelievable in the context of, winning a Grand Prix of that stature and then the sort of anticlimax of driving an E-Type and a 3.8 at Brands in the wet and then a Lotus 24 at Karlskoga. Nothing against 3.8s and E-Types, lovely, but, you'd want to have a bit of an afterglow, wouldn't you, after winning the German Grand Prix like that, I would have thought. And then, who won that race at Karlskoga? Good question. amazingly, it was won by Maston Gregory. He was in a UDT Laestal Lotus 24. So where was he at the Nürburgring? Well, I can answer that one. UDT Laestal, one of the few teams not given an entry for that 62 German Grand Prix. They would have been most annoyed about that, and they obviously went straight to Karlskoga. Maybe they did some testing there. And then, yeah, and I didn't mention this. I mentioned that Bandini... Oh no, look at this. Enna, yeah, not only did he win, Bandini won at Enna, but he was on the pole as well. And then that's how he got that, Ferrari. He was in the Ferrari, yeah. Brilliant. Mr. Michael Dunlop is the king of motorsport. Yeah. Drain covers are still more dangerous, says the XXX Opel 111. Well, you're right. But here's the interesting point. When that camera fell off, they got the... sorry, I'm just trying to do three things at once. They got the TV company to pay for the damage to the cars, or new cars, or whatever. I wonder who's paid for the damage to the Ferrari from that manhole cover in Vegas. Need to find out. I would hope the Vegas organisers. Freddie Vasseur wasn't very happy, was he? Correctly so. Imagine that. Richard Hinton says, sad news, Rosemary Smith passed away in a Dublin hospital yesterday. And Dave Pruitt passed away today. Rosemary Smith was really quick lady rally driver. Very, very good from the 60s. Always up there against the guys, doing a very, very good job. Shashank Kunjibetu says, hi Peter, would be too much to ask for you to set up an interview with Charles Leclerc. Would love to hear you two talk more about driving in the current Formula One cars. I'll give it a try. I'm not very hopeful because I know that if I said to Charles, would you do something? He'd say, yeah, no worries. Just tell me what time. Let me just check it with... And then he'll say, he wouldn't. He'd say, oh, Peter, just check it with Ferrari first. Just go through the media department. And I'll do that. And I won't even get a reply from them. It'll never happen. That's the problem today, And whereas if this was 1975 and we had a live stream like this and I wanted to ring up Ronnie Peterson, I'd ring up Ronnie and say, Ronnie, let's do the show. And he'd say, oh, yeah, very good. Okay. And you do it. He wouldn't say, oh, I'll go through the March media department, would he? But you got to do it now. So, Karel de Beaufort, Dutch nobleman, crashed in the famous banking of Arbus. Did he? I don't remember that. Obviously, you're not confusing him with Jean Bera with that one. This is from Erwin. So, yeah, lots of nice questions. Oh, another one. Oh, no, we got that one. I'm just going through very quickly through chat now if you wonder what I'm doing. I look a little bit. Okay, Rens van der Plug. I'll put this up because for those that weren't with us when we started the show, I did go on about this for quite a long time. And it's obviously a matter of moment in the sense that it's current. So I'll just mention it again, what my views are of this whole drama. Rens van der Plug, what is your view of the awkward situation that Susie Wolff and her husband regarding knowledge of things going on, FOM, FIA? Well, it shouldn't be an awkward situation, is my point, because in reality, a commercial rights holder shouldn't be anything more than a commercial rights holder, and the sport and everything that goes with the sport should actually be in the hands of the, not necessarily the teams and the competitors, but certainly of people in the business, as distinct from outside the business making movies or whatever. And this all started with Bernie creating commercial rights. And that's what Liberty are today. They're the commercial rights holders. And they're the people that Susie Wolff works for. whereas Toto Wolff obviously is one of the team owners of Formula One, or team principal and team owner, part team owner, and so there's a tremendous conflict of interest. Of course, there shouldn't be a conflict of interest. Why? Why should there be? Why isn't it open? Why isn't it an open book? Obviously, there are certain things that need to be subject to an NDA, like budget cap information, things like that. But that's really the FIA more than anything else. And I think this will very quickly blow over. But I think it's all a function of having a commercial rights holder and the complication of that in a sport like Formula One. It's not the same as a commercial rights holder in other sports, although it doesn't necessarily mean that other sports are better off without a commercial rights holder. It just means that it's less complicated. And I think Formula One would still have a lot of money coming into it if, for example, the teams did own the sport, and we'd still have the same TV deals, we'd still have the same situation. But because it's a big business for the commercial rights holder, they build up all these walls, and therefore that's why we have things like this going on. As I say, I think it'll blow over. It's the first point. I don't think, knowing Toto a little bit and Susie not at all, I can't imagine, however, that if either of them had signed an NDA, that they would breach that NDA, even behind closed doors in their own house. I really don't think they would do that. I think everybody's thinking, oh, they must talk about it, so therefore we must make an issue about this, particularly those who've had a problem with Toto on some other issue completely and want to cause trouble. But my view is that, this shouldn't be an issue, because what is it? What information is there that the teams shouldn't know and Liberty should, or vice versa? What? And I ask that question because we have this thing called commercial rights holders, and they build these walls. You go, well, because they're not allowed to talk about it. Why, is my point. And then beyond that, FIA have said that it's all going to be reviewed by the compliance board. And again, I've made the point that that's all very well, and that's probably the correct role for the FIA to be playing in this. But why tell everybody about it in public that you're going to do that? If you're going to do something, an investigation, the compliance board is going to do an investigation, keep it quiet until they've got the results. Why warn everybody that it's happening? To me, that's the most bizarre thing about it all, to be honest. It's just, to me, that's the FIA beating its chest saying, aren't we wonderful, we're going to do this. And for what purpose? Doesn't make much sense at all. Right, I think we've come to a point where Dexter needs to be walked and fed. He's been extremely good and patient, haven't you, Dex? And judging by his slumber, he's found this show to be unbelievably soporific. I hope you haven't, though. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've enjoyed Martin Tomlinson's art. And I say look for the description, because I'll add that to the description that's already there. I hope you've enjoyed looking back at some of his selection of work and those races and what they engendered. The Scale Extric Christmas present, which no doubt you'll all be out buying for yourselves. And thirdly, that look back at that amazing 62 German Grand Prix when we had 6 different cars in the first 6. What would it take? Somebody's put Dexter in there. What would it take for Formula One to create, instead of saying, oh, we want it easier to overtake, or we want the cars to be doing this or that, they said, all right, our goal for next year is to make sure that in at least 8 races, the top 6 positions are all filled by different makes of car. That's our goal. That's what we've got to create. How would they go about doing that? Oh, let's go back to 1962. It was pretty good back then. Anyway, there you go. Thank you very much for Death's Destruction. I think that's what you're saying. Thanks, Peter. I hope you and Dex have a good walk that evening. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. I'll do another live stream. As I say, I hope we'll have D. Heath on the show next week. It'll be recorded, but I haven't spoken to Dazza for quite a long time, so I'd love to catch up with him anyway and compare notes, as it were, and to get his input on everything, and also to have a look at some of his what he believes to be some of his best work from the year, which I'll try and get him to do. Which is quite a big ask, actually, for somebody like Daz, because he you know, those are worth a lot of money, his work, and he doesn't want to just put it out, any old stuff out on the internet. Okay, so just to go back to that bearer crash there, but he didn't survive. It was De Beaufort actually stepped back in his battered Porsche, rejoined the track, and got black flag later at Harvest. Yeah, no, he's a bit of a lad, wasn't he, old Count Carol Godin De Beaufort? Very good. How will this never-ending FIA v FOM Liberty war end? Midas Rashid. I mean, just a final point about this and whether or not there's been any, you know, vested interest in having two people joined at the, well, two people living together, two married people on two sides of the fence. One is F1 teams, the other is Liberty. But I mean, of course, the collusion between Bernie and Max was a billion times worse than any of this, and nobody cared at all. So, you know, why is there a big fuss now? Just go back to the Bernie and Max days, and if you really want to look at collusion. And actually, the reality is that Formula One ran pretty well in the Bernie and Max days. So there's another interesting point. But this one, FIA v Liberty, it's not, I don't think it is so much the FIA v Liberty, this one. This is more the FIA Liberty v the teams, isn't it? It's more that. And the FIA are in the middle saying, oh, we're going to investigate. But as I keep saying, why tell people you're going to investigate until you've investigated? Anyway, enough of that. I've said that a million times now, so I won't say it anymore. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for watching, and have a great week before I see you again next week. I'll try and make it this time so we can try and get some sort of consistency going with the live streams. And have a great week between now and then. Thank you to Jetcraft and to Pitbox.io, without whom this channel wouldn't exist, let alone be able to do what we do. And also to you, the viewer, for your support. Brilliant to have you. See you then. Take care, and let me get to the right page so I can do a proper ending to this. And where is it? Up here. I suppose it puts it in alphabetical order. That's why I can never find it. There we go. It's right at the end.